Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mama Jack podcast. Today we have a special guest, Stephanie. She will be talking about CVI, which I will let her explain to you because she's going to do it a lot better than I do. Her son was diagnosed with this at 15 years old, and it's a blindness. How, right? How do you not notice this until your son's 15 years old? Well, Stephanie's going to tell her story because he made it very easy for nobody to notice at all. Without any further delay, here's my interview with Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie. How are you?
I'm well. It's so nice to meet you, Jackie. Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
Of course. I heard your story and it's very interesting and something that most people have never heard of. And I really believe that everyone will have so much to learn about this. So why don't we dive right in? When did everything start with you? Tell us about, your unique experience with this.
Well, sure. Thank you so much. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an author, speaker, and international advocate for people who have something called cerebral/cortical visual impairment, or CVI. CVI is a brain-based vision impairment that's different from ocular blindness. Ocular blindness is caused by damage to the eye and the optic nerve, whereas CVI is caused by damage to the brain. We discovered in January of 2017 that my straight A honor student, genius artist, and water polo playing son Sebastian was almost completely blind, and no one knew, not even Sebastian himself. It was so incredibly devastating. I can't even tell you how upsetting this was. And we were just terrified for my son's safety. I was overwhelmed with guilt at not knowing that my own son was blind and completely baffled at how this could even be possible. And so I wanted to say right now, I'm actually a former music teacher. I made a major medical discovery in the field of visual neuroplasticity. And my son Sebastian is actually the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally, which means that he quite literally sees with words, just like a bat sees with sound. Dr. Lotfi Marabet, who is the director of the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at Shepard's Eye Research Institute, the associate scientist at Massachusetts Eye and Ear, and also an associate professor of ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School, actually captured my son's use of verbal mediation to process his vision in the fMRI. And he published a paper in Neurobiologia about a year and a half ago in collaboration with Dr. Barry Cran, who is the director of optometrics at the New England Eye Low Vision Clinic at the Perkins School for the Blind. And that paper is just on my son Sebastian and his use of verbal mediation to process his vision. And so this is a true story. This actually happened to us. And the reason that I'm here today is because what we discovered is that although my son's his neuroplastic adaptation to his neurological visual impairment is actually unique, his actual condition, the CVI itself, it's the number one cause of visual impairment in the developed world, and it still doesn't have a diagnostic code. Scientists have known that it's the number one cause of visual impairment for more than 10 years, and there's no diagnostic code for this condition. And that means that there is actually research coming out now showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom have symptoms of CVI, making CVI more prevalent than autism. And the vast majority of both medical professionals and educators have no training whatsoever in CVI. And so this is a true public health crisis. And so that's why I'm here today. And I just wanted to thank you again for this incredible opportunity to share our story, to help raise awareness about CVI so that what happened to our family never happens again to another. Thank you.
That is just so incredible. Well, first of all, I know mom guilt is always strong in every situation, right? But he was okay, right? So how are you to know? So as far as beating yourself up, and I'm sure you know that now, but it's one of those things, how could you know if he wasn't, obviously running into things or whatever, normal, people without vision do, then there's no signs. And it's incredible how far he came, having this condition and basically fooling the world. To me, it almost sounds like, and you're going to laugh whenever I say this, it's like a superhero thing. Like, it's so cool. I don't know why. It just seems so cool. And I don't mean to say it's so cool, like, oh, your son is like, you know, this, what, you know,
No, I
medical
understand.
whatever, but it's so interesting to me. It is so interesting to me. So when he was younger, was there anything, like, was he diagnosed with autism or anything? What was that like?
Absolutely not. So
Okay.
I'm here today because there is just an enormous amount of misinformation about CVI that has been promulgated throughout the educational, especially the educational communities, but the scientific and also the medical communities as well. There is just an enormous amount of completely fantastically wrong information about CVI. And so I'm really glad that you asked these questions. So first of all, the first myth I'd like to bust today is one that we were repeatedly told after we discovered that my son had CVI at the age of 15. We were repeatedly and falsely told that there was no possible way that my son could have a neurological visual impairment because the wrong information we were told from some of the best medical professionals here in the US is that we were told that all people who have CVI are severely developmentally delayed. Well, that just isn't true. We have actual research showing that 1 in 30 students in a regular education classroom have symptoms of CVI. And in fact, the New York Times recently published an article a few months ago about how 1 in 30 people have prosopagnosia or face blindness. Face blindness is a very common symptom of this very common visual impairment. And all 1 in 30 people are not severely developmentally delayed, right? They're typical.
Yeah.
So it's just misinformation. And so I'm here today to talk about the fact that CVI can indeed be an entirely invisible disability, even very severe CVI. And my son actually has a very severe CVI. And in fact, he is almost completely blind. And there is no way to tell academically, socially, or physically. And there never has been, because my son had all normal developmental milestones. He literally took the training wheels off his bike when he was 4 years old. He's been riding around our neighborhood ever since, almost completely blind. And I'm so glad that you brought up the whole idea of people bumping into things. This is a stereotype about blindness. It's a stereotype. And the reason I want to talk about stereotypes, because when most people think about blindness, what they know is ocular blindness, right? And ocular blindness is where there's damage to the eye and the optic nerve. And the stereotype of ocular blindness is that everything is black. When you're blind, everything's black and you can't see. But this is actually a stereotype for ocular blindness as well. The vast majority of people who are ocularly blind have some remaining vision. It might just be light perception. They might be able to detect shadowy figures, that kind of thing. But very few ocularly blind people are actually completely lacking all vision. So that's a stereotype. And so what we're learning more and more now is that vision is far more complicated than just what ocular vision entails. It's actually far more complicated, and it's actually more common.
So your son, how you were telling me a little bit before, whenever we had talked before this interview, about how your son's blindness can come like in and out. Can you explain that to everybody?
Absolutely. So my son is actually the only person in the world known to be able to see with words. Okay. And so it's a little hard to describe. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about, if it's okay with you, can I talk about what CVI is?
Mm-hmm.
And then I can tell everybody what my son can't see. And then I'll talk about what he can see. And then I can explain how it is that he loses his vision entirely.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead. Yeah.
It's just complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So CVI is a brain-based vision impairment. And I was at a conference this past summer with Dr. Arvind Chandna and also Dr. Gordon Dutton, the best CVI researchers in the world, and some of the best. And Dr. Arvind Chandna was talking about they have actually measured the amount of time it takes between the light hits the retina of the eye and the light is converted into an electrical signal that travels through the optic nerve past the lateral geniculate nuclei, or the LGN. And when it finally arrives at the back of the brain, it takes a tenth of a second after the light hits the retina for that signal to travel to the back of the brain. And that's when there's finally conscious perception of sight. There is literally no conscious perception of sight whatsoever when the light hits the eyes. And what that means is we don't see with our eyes. We see with our brains. That is not a slogan. It's an actual scientific fact. Our eyes are just light collectors. They collect the light, they transmit it into a signal. All of our conscious perception of seeing happens within our brains. And more than 40% of our brains are involved in visual processing because there's so much going on, and different parts of our brains handle different parts of vision. So what happens is when that signal reaches the back of the brain, there are two different pathways of visual processing. There's the dorsal stream and the ventral stream. The dorsal stream starts at the back of the brain and comes up the back of the head and across the top. And I always think of like the dorsal fin of a shark, right? And that is, I think, I kind of describe that as like the where kind of part of visual processing. People who have damage to the dorsal stream of their brain often have difficulty finding a face in a crowd. They very commonly have very severe difficulties in crowded environments like a grocery store. If you can imagine, like standing in front of the shelves, just full of stuff, like trying to find that cereal box that you want in just shelves full of different boxes of different things. A child who has dorsal stream impairment might have difficulty finding their shoes in a pile on the floor. They could have difficulty finding a specific toy in a toy box crowded full of toys. And so one of the best examples, I think, of visual crowding is the children's book, Where's Waldo? You think about that, finding that little guy in those visually crowded scenes. People who have dorsal stream impairment can actually find it nauseating and so uncomfortable even to try to look at Where's Waldo. It actually makes them physically sick trying to even to look at it. And it can often find it just even impossible to do the activity because they can't see it. They can't see what we see. And it's just overwhelming. So that's the dorsal stream. The ventral stream of visual processing goes through the bottom center of the brain. And I want to be really clear that these are not two separate streams of visual processing. They actually talk back and forth to each other. And so there is actual documented and demonstrated communication between these two streams of visual processing. So they're not separate. And if you have damage in one area, it's going to impact the other area, if that makes sense. So anyway, the ventral stream is where we have visual recognition. Different parts of the brain are involved in recognizing different things. In a neurotypical brain, people who have neurotypical vision, for us, visual recognition is automatic. It is effortless. When I say the words Mona Lisa, people who are neurotypical and have neurotypical vision, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You can picture it in your brain. And if you saw that picture hanging on a wall, you go, oh, Mona Lisa, with zero effort on your part. That's visual recognition. So the different parts of the brain handle different parts of visual recognition. And if you take your right hand and you touch above and behind your right ear, that's where the right fusiform gyrus of the brain is. And that's where facial recognition takes place. People who have damage to the right fusiform gyrus of the brain can have a condition, which is a common symptom of CVI, called prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia means face blindness. And so it's the inability to recognize people's faces. And then processed right close to that is our ability to recognize environments. Very often, people who have prosopagnosia also have a companion disorder called topographical agnosia. Topographical agnosia is the inability to recognize your environments. And that means doesn't matter how many times you walk into your own home, your own bedroom, any place, nothing ever looks familiar, ever. And it doesn't matter how many times you see it, how many times you experience it, it never records a visual memory. And so people who have topographical agnosia cannot form mental maps of their surroundings because they have no visual landmarks ever of anything around them. So that's a common part. There's also people who have damage to the right fusiform gyrus of the brain often have both prosopagnosia and topographical agnosia because they're so close together. If one area is damaged, the other one is also usually damaged as well, or often damaged as well. So there are different areas of the brain for recognizing different things. There's an area of the brain that recognizes objects. There's an area of the brain that recognizes words, letters, numbers, simple shapes. There's a different area that recognizes biological forms, hands, feet, body. There's even a finger agnosia. There are people alive right now who have lost the ability to recognize theirs and others' fingers because that part of their brain that recognizes fingers has been damaged. And so all these things happen in different parts of the ventral stream. Okay. So vision is very complicated. And so for Sebastian has both dorsal and ventral stream impairment. So he has difficulty with the crowds and crowded scenes, like finding a face in a crowd, going to the grocery store, finding an object on a crowded shelf, all of those issues with the dorsal stream impairment. But he also has really severe ventral stream impairment as well. And so we discovered that he has face blindness. So he has no ability to recognize faces. He has no ability to recognize places. So he has topographical agnosia as well as prosopagnosia. He has no ability to recognize objects. So none of his environments are familiar, and none of the objects within his environments are recognizable to him. I shouldn't say familiar, I should say visually recognizable. And so he has a lot of visual problems with recognition. And the only things that my son, I should also say biological forms, because for my son, he also can't recognize not just faces, but also his own hands, feet, body, or anybody else's. And that includes animals. So he can't recognize cows, dogs, cats. And that came as a really huge surprise to us because, as I mentioned at the beginning, my son's a very, very gifted artist who draws and paints with photographic realism when he wants to, and has been doing this for years. And so we had absolutely no idea that he had any problem at all with visual recognition because he's so artistic. So the only things that my son can see like a neurotypical person are words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes. Because the areas of my son's brain that recognize words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes are still intact. He didn't suffer brain damage to those areas during his traumatic birth. And so what that means is for my son, he explains that his functional vision, for him, it feels like in his own words, being in an alternate universe where nothing ever looks familiar except for words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can imagine being out in a boat in a foggy ocean, and the fog is just swirls of color. It's not white fog. It's just swirls of random colors. Everything is random. There's nothing recognizable around you ever, except every once in a while, a sign floats past with words on it. And you can read the sign. And then after it floats past, it disappears and you have no idea where it went.
Mm-hmm.
And then another sign floats past, right? And that, you read the words and then that disappears and you have no idea where it went because there's nothing else recognizable around you and it's just gone. And so that's my son's visual world. That's what he lives with every day. And so my son quite literally has to guess who and what every single thing and every single person that he encounters in daily life, he has to guess who and what they are based on the way we describe them verbally rather than how we identify them visually. And so my son actually taught himself in very early childhood, like late infancy, early toddlerhood, he learned that if he used the verbal descriptors to describe things to himself, that he could get a momentary glimpse of what things look like. My son is not alone in having a unique visual processing. I just want to take a moment to talk about another person with unique visual processing to help the listeners understand how this could be possible. So, when we talked at the beginning about how visual recognition or how vision works, and we talked about how our eyes actually don't see anything at all, there are people alive on Earth right now who have no eyes, but who can see. And I'd like to take a moment to talk about Daniel Kish. Daniel Kish lost both eyes to cancer in infancy, and he taught himself how to echolocate. Daniel sees like a bat sees or a dolphin. Although Daniel has no eyes, he can ride a bike. He can describe visual scenes. If you take him somewhere that he's never been, he can tell you what he sees. And in fact, Daniel can read if the letters are three-dimensional. And he has no eyes. And so when they put Daniel in the fMRI, and fMRI is a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine that tells you what the brain is actually doing, they discovered that Daniel's visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds, which means that Daniel quite literally sees with echoes, just like a bat or a whale or a dolphin. My son spent 6 hours in the fMRI for the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity. And just like Daniel, we discovered that my son's visual cortex lights up when he thinks words to himself, the verbal descriptors of what's around him. And so before I had cataract surgery a couple years ago, I used to wear glasses all the time. And my verbal characteristics used to be tall, blonde glasses. And when my son thinks those words to himself, he literally gets a momentary glimpse of what I look like. Despite being almost completely blind, he gets a flash. And in his words, he says he gets an idea of it. It's just a flash of understanding, and then it's gone. There's no retention in visual memory, like when I said Mona Lisa, and all the neurotypical people had an quick picture in their mind of what Mona Lisa is. My son can't do that for anything, not for faces, places, objects, people, none of that. But he can think the verbal characteristics of things and then just get this quick flash of vision, and then it's gone. And so when you ask the question, I know it's a really long answer to your question, but you were wondering, you asked about how he could have his vision, like how he could lose all his vision. Well, the reality is there's two pieces to this. First of all, my son is the only person in the world known to be able to choose to see or not see with his eyes wide open. Sebastian quite literally cannot see anything without the use of his verbal mediation. He has no conscious perception of sight unless he's thinking verbal descriptors to himself actively. When he turns that off and stops thinking about the verbal descriptors of whatever's around him, the very little vision that he has disappears entirely. And in fact, Dr. Marabet at the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity actually captured that in the fMRI. And so Sebastian actually spends most of his waking hours with his vision off because he actually has two disorders. It's not just CVI. He also has something called Central Auditory Processing Disorder, or CAPD. CAPD is CVI's auditory cousin. Just like with CVI, which is the visual problem, the eyes technically see light, right? They process light and it travels into the brain, but the brain isn't able to, or struggles to make that into a recognizable image that can be seen and perceived. With CAPD, the ears technically hear, they are collecting the sound, but the brain cannot, or it struggles to process those sounds into recognizable and understandable language. And so people with CAPD very often pass all the vision screenings, just like my blind son passed every vision test every year, because technically he has normal acuity. It's actually common for people who have CVI to have normal acuity and pass their vision tests. This happens all the time. And so my son has CVI. He has the vision processing, and he also has the auditory processing disorder. And I'm here today to say that I think one of the biggest tragedies of our time is the failure of our medical profession to recognize deafblindness as a spectrum disorder. I consider my son to be deafblind on the deafblind spectrum because my son is almost completely blind and he also has CAPD. And the reason that he has auditory processing issues is because in order for him to see as well as he's able to, which is really very minimally, but it's a little bit, he has to continuously think word descriptors to himself. And if you could imagine that you were going to a physics lecture and you were going to learn from this physics lecture, and in order to watch the slides up on the board and see what the teacher was doing and listen, you had to silently recite, for example, the Declaration of Independence to yourself while you listened to the physics lecture. You would have a really hard time trying to get any understandable information out of the lecture itself because your brain's busy reciting the Declaration of Independence. That's what my son has to do. And for that reason, he cannot see as well as he's able to and hear as well as he is able to at the same time. And a long time ago, he realized if he just stopped focusing on the vision and stopped reciting the verbal descriptors to himself, he could focus just on hearing. And so for my son, most of the day is spent with his vision off. If he's just hanging out with his friends, listening to the conversation, his vision is off entirely and he's fully blind because he's listening to the conversation. He uses his vision actively for visual tasks, for example, like cooking. You need to cut a red pepper, or cleaning the bathroom, or doing academic tasks, or creating an art project. But for just hanging out during the day, his vision is off and he's just listening to what's going on around him. There's another piece to this as well. Another very commonly misunderstood part of CVI, and a very common and actually very well documented symptom of CVI, is called visual tiring. People who have CVI have less visual processing power in their brains than neurotypical people do because they have brain damage to the parts of their brains that process vision. And so one of the very common symptoms of CVI is visual tiring, and that is the complete loss of all vision involuntarily due to stress, overtiring, overheating, illness. Any of those things or all of them can trigger the little bit of vision that these people have left to just completely go away. And I know people are going, how could that be possible? Well, I hope some of you listeners out there have fainted before, because I've actually fainted. I've only fainted once, but when I fainted, my vision completely blacked out. And then after that happened, I lost consciousness. It was very quick, but I saw everything went black and then I was no longer conscious. And so visual tiring in people with CVI is a function of the exact same process of what happens when people faint. And it's basically a function of blood pressure. As the blood pressure drops and gets lower, people who have CVI, who have less visual processing power, they are just more susceptible to that symptom of blacking out of the vision than neurotypical people are because they have typical brains. And so basically, it's just that first piece of blacking out where the vision just disappears. And that is a common and well-documented symptom of CVI. And it's, again, very poorly understood. People who have CVI are routinely accused of faking their vision loss. And it's just sad because, I mean, we've known that vision blacks out when people faint for, I don't know how many years.
Yeah.
And decades. And it's just no different. It's caused by the exact same thing. So
let's say, for instance, in your son's eyes, with me right now seeing, I'm looking at a mug. So he would be able to see if he's like describing that mug in his head and everything like that. But the second he stops that, it kind of like he can't process that it's there.
it just disappears for him.
Okay.
It's just a flash. So if if it was a white mug, he, and I also want to say he has another common symptom of CVI, which is he has a very common symptom of CVI called simultaneous agnosia. And so that often means that people can only see one thing at a time or one part of a thing at a time. And for my son, what that means is he has full visual fields like a typical person does, a neurotypical person does. And that means like a visual field is how wide and far you can see. And they measure that with a special machine at the eye doctors that like flashes little lights or has little moving pieces that detect whether you can see light or motion. Well, my son can see light and motion. So on visual field monitors or machines, it always comes out that his visual fields are normal. However, as we talked, what he can perceive in that area is just this cloud of useless color and motion, vague, blurry shapes. It's all just this blurry fog of nothingness, nothing useful. And then in the very center of his visual field, he has a teeny tiny little hole, a little patch of acuity that's big enough for him so that when he's reading something in 10-point font, he can usually see about 2 letters at a time.
Okay, so reading for him. How can he read? Like
Oh, yeah.
books? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and that's how come it went. So we talked about how the only things that my son can see like a neurotypical person are words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes. And so my son quite literally taught himself to read and to write at the age of 2.5. He was reading the old Nancy Drew book, chapter books, with all the lawyerly language that I remember struggling with as a second and third grader. My son was reading the Nancy Drew books when he was 4 and understanding them. And so he was identified as very, very gifted very early. And in fact, his gifted teacher created a special pull-out program just for him alone when he entered kindergarten because he was so far above where he should have been. And I just want to be really clear. One of the hugest pieces of misinformation that has been promulgated for years is that all people who have CVI are intellectually impaired, that this is an intellectual impairment. You often hear people saying they see what you see, their brains just can't process it. Well, that's just wrong. The reason people who have CVI have difficulty is because they don't see what you see, as we talked about at the beginning. Their eyes don't see anything, they just capture light. All of the seeing is happening in the brain. And if the brain is not processing it, that means the brain is not seeing, and that's where seeing happens, as we know from Daniel Kish. And so I was really, really grateful that the Perkins School for the Blind, I think it was last year, put out an official statement recognizing that all people who have CVI, this is a vision impairment. It is not an intellectual impairment. It is not. And so my son actually just got lucky. This was pure luck that when my son had a traumatic birth, the areas of his brain that recognize words, letters, numbers, and symbols, those areas were not damaged. And so he has the ability to recognize those things, even though he can't recognize faces or places or objects or biological forms in the same way that a neurotypical person can. And so my son has always had visual access to numeracy and literacy. And he's always scored in the 99th percentile in all math and English standardized testing without any preparation whatsoever.
Yeah,
Ever.
because he's a superhero. Like I said, he has total concentration on what he's doing all the time.
Oh, he's a kid, just like, just like
Like,
everybody
yeah,
else.
but most like
Mm.
this is what I'm thinking is most of the time you're doing something and then you get sidetracked. He can't do that. So he like you said it was water polo, right? Is that what you said he was playing? What did you say he
Yeah, he was on the diving team. He did water polo.
he has to like that's literally the best you can do with that is concentrating completely on what you're doing, because if he didn't he would lose it. So literally like I have to place my feet like this, I have to look down here, my body has to bend this way, this is like kind of what he's thinking in his head, correct? Because he has to totally be concentrating on what he's doing. So
He
he
has
just has hyper focus, kind of like, I don't know if you could like medically consider it hyper focus on either like processing like reading, or when he's doing something like art, like he has to visually be saying everything he's doing. So that's like hyper concentration, right?
So for him, I just want to say that He's just naturally gifted. And I think that he's pretty much a typical person in other ways, that he's just a kid, and he's
Mhm.
just a typical kid. And and I don't think that I just want to be really clear. All people who have CVI develop really brilliant ways of compensating. This is not unique to my son.
Mhm.
All people, they're forced to develop ways of compensating because they're forced to live in a world that doesn't recognize that they're visually impaired slash blind. And so they come up with these ingenious ways of compensating. And I want to take a minute to talk about a very dear friend of mine who discovered that her daughter actually has worse CVI than Sebastian. It hurt. She's blind. I mean, this kid is blind. I mean, I describe my son is blind because his vision's off most of the time. And when it's on, it's very minimal. So he's got almost nothing. But this child, she, they discovered at the age of 12 that this child had CVI. And just like with my son, this child passed for typically sighted for 12 years. My son went till 15 till we accidentally discovered it, right? So this happens all the time. And what they figured out is the mom is brilliant. She's an educator. And the daughter is brilliant. Like my son, extremely verbal, absolutely able to describe her own functional vision now that she knows that her vision is different. And to all the listeners out there, I just want to be really clear. All people who are born with CVI have no idea they have CVI, idea that they're blind or visually impaired because they assume that you see what they see. They assume that their vision is typical because they didn't lose their vision. They came into this world with the vision as it is, right? So they have no way of knowing what typical vision is like because they've never experienced it. And
Mhm.
so they cannot tell you that they're blind. None of them can. They don't know. And so what happened was my friend discovered that her child had CVI at the age of 12. And what they realized, so the mom is an educator, they homeschool, and they realized around the age of 6 or 7 that their child was having difficulty with reading and with math. And so they did every single research based dyslexia intervention under the sun, one-on-one instruction because they're homeschooled. The mom is an educator. She's very capable, very brilliant. The daughter is brilliant, and nothing worked. And what they discovered was this child, like my son, can pass for typically sighted because he can read, because the parts of his brain that recognize words, letters, numbers, right? Those parts work so he can read. So he looks like he's typically sighted. This child managed to learn to mimic reading. She could not decode because my friend's child has no ability whatsoever to form a visual memory of a letter or a number. Those parts of her brain are damaged. And so, despite years of intensive one on one intervention with every type of letter and word recognition and number recognition, this child can't form a visual memory of it. And what she learned to do was she learned to memorize the outside shapes of words. And so she created what she calls tactile stencils. She could feel what the outside shape of the word felt like. And she learned to mimic reading because she could remember the tactile outside shape of what a word would like, the shape of the outside exterior of a word. And then she could identify the word through guessing, just like my son can guess who I am based on tall blonde glasses. However, if you put me in a room full of other tall blonde women wearing glasses, my son would have a hard time unless he could hear my voice.
Yeah.
Right. And so this child struggled really tremendously because think about the outside shape of the word book and the outside shape of the word beak.
Yeah.
Right. So she was guessing, and it was very stressful and horrible. And so after they discovered this child had CVI, I think it was in the fall of last year. I think it's been about a year and a half. They started Braille, and this child is excelling and is reading at grade level for the very first time. She is doing tactile geography where you can feel the maps. She's doing Nemeth code for math and is excelling at math. It's just unreal the transformation that has happened for this child, because for the first time, this child is being recognized as blind and is actually getting blind services. She has a white cane now and is no longer terrified about going out into public. This family was having trouble for years with this child having meltdowns in public and having nobody understand why. And none of the doctors understood why, and nobody knew why she was emotionally dysregulated. And it was just like, well, she just needs to be medicated. Well, no, what she needed was she needed blind skills.
Yeah.
And that's why I do this, because if my son can pass for typically sighted and be almost completely blind, and my friend's daughter can pass for typically sighted and really be completely blind, right? And they're passing for typically sighted till they're 12, 15. I have a dear friend in Iceland who is legally blind in Iceland who didn't get her CVI diagnosed until she was 26. 26 years of being blind without anybody knowing and being treated as a typically sighted person. And she's blind. It's just tragic what happens to these people. And I want to be really, really clear. Because of my work as a CVI advocate, I talk to families of children who have CVI. I talk with adults who have CVI, teens who have CVI. Every single one of them, and I know quite a few now, every single one of them who went for years without a diagnosis suffered pretty terrible trauma as a result. It is terrifying to be blind and have nobody around you know and do nothing to help you. And my son suffered terribly. My friend's daughter suffered terribly. My friend in Iceland suffered terribly. It is terrifying. And it often manifests as anxiety, unexplainable anxiety. And that's what happened to my friend's daughter. This is what happened to my son. So the only clues that we had that there might be anything wrong with my son whatsoever was what appeared to be mild anxiety that started at around the age of 2.5. And my son started to express anxiety about going to visually complex areas like our neighborhood grocery store, to his gymnastics class. And he called it a game. That was his word for it. He said, I'm going to play the I'm nervous game, Mom. And we'd get in the car and he'd say, I'm nervous, Mom. I'm nervous. And I'd be like, we're going to the grocery store like we did last week. Why would you be nervous about going to the same grocery store? I'm used 2.5 and extremely verbal, and remember, kids with CVI who are born with CVI can't tell you they're blind. They can't tell you they can't see. All they know is that things are scary. It's just scary being blind out in the world and having, or having very minimal vision and not knowing what it is that's coming at you or what's around you, And so he was 2.5 and telling us that he was nervous. He was nervous. And when I approached his doctor and asked his doctor about this, I was just brushed off, because here's my kid excelling academically at the age of 2.5. He's reading and writing. He is making eye contact. We actually have photo after photo of my blind son who had all normal developmental milestones and who can't recognize his face or anybody else's. I have photo after photo of him making regular, consistent eye contact from his earliest days. Photo after photo. And so there was no way to tell. And so the doctor just told us, well, he's just trying to get negative attention, just distract him with something else. And that's what I did. And it worked. But what happened is, when my son went off to preschool, then my son cried every day for 2 years of drop-offs at preschool and for quite a lot of kindergarten as well. Despite being one of the older kids, he had a fall birthday. He was very mature. He was extremely social. He had a wonderful group of friends that he loved. He was outgoing. He was academically successful. He loved his teacher. It made absolutely no sense. Why is my kid crying at drop-off every day? He doesn't fit the profile. And when I asked his teacher, and again, when I asked his doctor, I was told, some kids just do this. We worry about the ones who can't settle down.
Yeah.
And my son settled down quickly every day. And because he appeared to be fine, it was swept under the carpet. And what we know now is that my son wasn't fine. He was scared. He needed assistance. He couldn't recognize his teacher, his classmates, his classroom, the toys in the classroom. It was terrifying. And he swallowed all that fear and internalized all that anxiety. And what he learned at a very young age was that telling adults that he was afraid did not help. He did not outgrow his fear. He simply stopped telling us he was scared.
Yeah.
And that's a very important distinction because people often think, well, they're fine because they're not talking about it anymore. Well, wrong. Kids will give up telling you that there's something wrong if you don't respond appropriately. And so I am here today to call for the universal screening of all preschoolers for CVI. There is no way that you can tell whether your child might have CVI by looking at them. Your child could very well have CVI and pass. And I want to go back a little bit and talk about the whole looking at faces versus being able to recognize a face. So, two things that I haven't talked about today, and things that you kind of brought up, but we haven't yet discussed, is blind sight. There is a reason that my son can play water polo, and it's not the hyperfocus that you talk about. There's a reason that my son can walk through space and has never bumped into things despite being almost completely blind. My son has something called blind sight. Blind sight is a symptom of CVI that we have known about now for 100 years, and it has been studied for 100 years. We have known about it since World War I, when we had soldiers come home from the war who had survived gunshot wounds to the head. Their eyes and their optic nerves were fine, and yet they were blind and they could not see. And they've realized that some of these people who had no conscious perception of sight whatsoever could still walk through a crowded room without bumping into anything, without realizing that they were avoiding obstacles. This is what blind sight is. There's a wonderful article on NPR. It's entitled The Blind Woman Who Saw Rain, and it is just a great description of what blind sight is. In this true story, a woman had a stroke I'm not sure how old she was, but she was an adult, and she lost all conscious perception of sight. She lost the ability to see light, color. She thought she'd lost everything. And the doctors told her, well, you're just blind now, so you're just going to have to get used to that. And then if some time went by and she realized that she could see the motion of the rain coming down the windshield of the car. She realized she could see the motion of her daughter's ponytail as her daughter skipped ahead of her. She couldn't see the ponytail. She could just see the swish of the motion of the ponytail as she skipped. And so this is what blind sight is. It's a function of motion perception. My son has blind sight. And so what that means is you could take him and put him in a crowded warehouse full of obstacles, things all over the floor, things hanging from the ceiling, everything everywhere. And my son could walk through that entire warehouse and never bump into anything because of that function of the remaining bit of motion perception that he has. And that's what allowed him to play water polo because he could see the motion of the other swimmers. He could see the motion of the ball, even if he couldn't see the ball itself. So yeah, so that's blind sight. And so to get back to the whole facial recognition and there's a huge myth, another one I'd like to bust today, and it's that all people who have CVI, they don't make eye contact. Well, as I said earlier, we have photo after photo of my blind son making regular, consistent eye contact from birth because my son has something called affective blind sight. My son is able to recognize facial expressions just like neurotypical people can, even though he can't recognize the faces themselves. Think about that for a minute. How big of a motivator would that be for an infant to seek out faces to look at if he can see the expression of the face, even though he can't recognize the faces themselves? And so he has always been extremely attuned to facial expressions. He's always made eye contact, what appears to be eye contact, all his life. He's always passed for neurotypical. But I do also, you asked if he had been diagnosed with autism, and the answer is absolutely not because he had no symptoms of autism. But he was repeatedly misdiagnosed. And this is very common for people who have CVI. And in fact, Children who have CVI are routinely misdiagnosed with autism because many of them don't make eye contact because they may not have that ability to recognize the facial expressions the way my son does. So that's one thing. But they're also routinely misdiagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders and intellectual disabilities. And so this happens every day all across the world where children who are blind and visually impaired are incorrectly labeled as everything else except what they are, which is blind. And it's just tragic.
That's, yes, that is very tragic. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. This is so interesting. I mean, it makes sense, right? If part of your brain is not working, part of your brain isn't working. And we think about that with intellectual things, but you never think like, no, your brain controls everything, kind of like a stroke. If you
Yeah.
have a stroke, you didn't like really damage everything on one side of your body, but that side of your part of your brain isn't working. So it's kind of not similar to that, right? It's like one part is damaged and that is what's doing all this. So you said from birth he had this, right?
Yes. So I
Yeah.
want to talk about two things. So think about having cerebral palsy, right?
Hmm.
Many people have cerebral palsy from brain damage, which is damage to the brain that causes a difficulty controlling the muscles of the body, right?
Hmm.
And it's not all or nothing, right? You
Yeah.
don't either have cerebral palsy and no muscles work, or you don't have cerebral palsy and all muscles work, right? There's a million shades of gray, and some people have very mild cerebral palsy that might only affect a little bit on one side. Some people have very severe cerebral palsy that might affect everything, and there's every shade of gray in between. Visual processing is the same. It is, I just feel like we are living in a world where we have all had this kindergarten idea of vision being black and white. It's either all on and everything is light, or it's all off and everything is dark. And that's just not how vision works. There's just a million variations in between. And as Dr. Gordon Dutton always says, if you've met one person with CVI, you have met one person with CVI, because where the brain damage happens is fairly random. And so there are many commonalities between people who have CVI, dorsal stream dysfunction, that whole where system of the brain, difficulties with visual crowding. That's a very common symptom of CVI. Face blindness is a common symptom of CVI, right? So, but it doesn't mean that everyone who has CVI is face blind, because not everybody's might have damage to the right fusiform gyrus of the brain. Their brain damage might be elsewhere, so every
Hmm.
person is unique. And now I forgot the other half of your question. What was the other thing?
Well, I have another question actually. So,
Yeah.
has anything changed since you found this out? Do you do anything different in your home, or has it pretty much just continued the same because he was so used to everything? Like, I'm sure you're more aware of certain situations he's uncomfortable with, but did you have to, all of a sudden change your house in any way? I know you said he can get around, so that's not an issue, but what has changed in your life since you realized that this was his diagnosis?
Well, so much has changed. So the way we discovered that Sebastian had CVI was we were going through old photos. And I'm one of those moms who quite literally made my son a baby book and then discovered I'm totally not crafty and never wanted to make another album again. And I never did make another album again. And so we had a lot of pictures that we hadn't gone through for like 15 years, right? So we were going through these old photos that we hadn't looked at in a long time. And we discovered that my son, who draws and paints faces and everything else that interests him with photographic realism when he wants to, couldn't recognize his own face. And he's an only child. So it's not like I have like 10 kids that he was like, oh, is that me or is that my brother? No,
Yeah.
there's just one kid. He was looking at pictures of his own face for half an hour. And I was narrating to him about who was in the pictures, blah, blah, blah. So long story short, the next day was when we discovered that my son had taught himself to navigate by counting his steps and turns and was navigating our own home that way. And that's when I got scared for his safety. because he was planning to go off to college in the city of Chicago. And we figured out at home that he was getting around. He learned the patterns of our neighborhood by following us around. And he was silently counting his steps and turns as he followed us around. We didn't know what he was doing. And he told us he assumed that that's what we were doing. He just assumed that counting steps and turns is how people get around because that's what he had to do. So he was just doing it silently on his own, and we had no idea. And I could not send him off to college in Chicago when we realized how severe his vision was. It's like, this is dangerous. He needs to have blind skills. He needs to have orientation and mobility training. So we realized, because my son could read, that he could learn to use Google Maps to navigate without relying on following another person around all the time to figure out where things are.
Yeah.
And to live independently. But we didn't know initially, when we first discovered all this, whether he would be able to do that. I didn't know. And so we went overnight from being the very lucky parents of what we thought was just an extremely gifted kid to not knowing if my son could ever learn to navigate independently without having another person leading him around, you know?
Yeah.
And I didn't know that. But I knew that he needed to have the opportunity to try and to get training. And in order to do that, I knew he had to have a medical diagnosis, because you cannot access occupational therapy for navigation or orientation and mobility training without a medical diagnosis of some kind for vision impairment or blindness. And so what changed for us overnight was then I won't tell all the details, but because doctors get no training in CVI, and there's only a handful of doctors that I can even recommend in the world who I think actually understand CVI, we had more than $150,000 in medical bills trying to get a diagnosis for my son's common symptoms of his common visual impairment. And I was using the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from the very first appointment after we discovered what he had. I had hard evidence of the fact that my son had CVI in the form of 2 separate neuropsych evaluations done years apart, demonstrating that my son was scoring at the very top. He scored a perfect 150 in the verbal portion of the IQ test, and he had more than a 20-point gap in the visual spatial. And here's my kid who is scoring in the 99th percentile on all math and all English, on all standardized testing without any preparation whatsoever, right? And like, there's a mismatch here. Why is there this huge gap in visual spatial? And the doctors just were like, I can't help you. I don't know anyone who can. Good luck with that. They dropped us. We were labeled crazy by the medical establishment and repeatedly verbally and emotionally abused. I had to take my son to Paris for a week-long research study with Dr. Sylvie Chokran, who is the director of the Unit of Vision and Cognition at La Fondation Rothschild in Paris. She's an amazing, brilliant vision and brain researcher. And I couldn't get anyone here in the US to listen to us until we came home from Paris. And the reason that appointment was the research study was important is because from that, we got a SPECT scan of my son's brain. So I'm here to bust another myth about CVI. We were repeatedly and incorrectly told that there was no possible way that my son could have a neurological visual impairment because he has a normal appearing MRI. That's wrong. In fact, we know that about 10% of people who have cerebral palsy have normal appearing MRIs, and yet they still have cerebral palsy because they have brain damage that isn't visible on an MRI scan. Brain damage can be microscopic and still cause severe problems depending on where it is. It doesn't show necessarily. So it's believed that approximately 10% or more of people who have CVI also have normal appearing brain scans. So anyway, we got a SPECT scan from Dr. Chakran, and a SPECT scan is a nuclear medicine test that measures the blood flow to the brain. And that tells you any areas of the brain that don't get any blood flow, that's dead tissue. And we found that my son did indeed have very significant brain damage to the visual processing centers of his brain, including the right fusiform gyrus of his brain, because he had a traumatic birth. And so that was what finally we were able to get help from the Perkins School for the Blind. And I will always be so incredibly grateful to Dr. Barry Cran at the Perkins School for the Blind, who is just a leading researcher and an amazing human being. And that's how we also connected with Dr. Lotfi Maribet, who directs the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at Shepard's Eye Research Institute. And so what has changed? Things have changed for Sebastian because we were able, 15 months after we discovered Sebastian with CVI and $150,000 and being labeled crazy and all that stuff, we finally had a diagnosis from the best specialists in the world. And we were able to access occupational therapy for navigation for Sebastian through a fabulous occupational therapy place here in Chicago. And they literally taught my son how to navigate the city of Chicago using Google Maps on his phone. And so they taught him how to use public transit because he's so severely blind that he can never drive. He's going to rely on public transportation his whole life. And so they taught him how to use the subway. They taught him how to use public transportation. And he's able now to live independently. And because we were able to get a diagnosis finally for my son, Leader Dogs for the Blind is a guide dog organization. They flew him out, all expenses paid. They're a fabulous organization. And they did a week-long orientation and mobility training camp with him there on their campus, where he doesn't use a guide dog because he's actually a very fast walker. And because he has blind sight, he doesn't bump into things. So he doesn't need a guide dog. But they worked with him on working with a white cane because my son actually does go randomly completely blind. As we talked about, this is a common and well-documented symptom of CVI. Like, when you faint and your vision blacks out, he has that when he gets too sick or too overheated or too tired. And so he needed to have a white cane for when his vision is at its worst. And in fact, he is using his white cane on his college campus right now when he goes to class. It helps him to save up the little bit of vision that he has for when he needs it in class. It is really hugely helpful for him. And so that has been a change for him. And he's now living independently. He lives in Chicago. He's going to university full time. And so that's been a huge change. But the most important thing that has changed has been Dr. Lotfi Maribet, the director of the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity, has told me that Sebastian is now the most studied individual in the world with CVI. We returned to the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity last summer, and Sebastian participated again. And Dr. Maribet told me that they have changed the entire direction of the research study that they are doing there based on what they learned off Sebastian the first time we were there in 2018. And they are now tracking the verbal IQ scores of everyone who comes through the study, and they are looking at verbal mediation and how that is used as a compensatory strategy for people who have CVI.
That's
And
incredible.
yes. And I mean, I knew it was important because we figured all this out at home, and I knew my son taught himself to see with words through art. This is a teachable skill. My son taught himself to identify everything he encountered in daily life by drawing, painting, and sculpting it. He was obsessed with art from the time he was very little. And I mean, it started in the bathtub when he was just barely a toddler, painting on his skin, painting on the walls of the bathtub. And I just let him do it because he loved it. I had no idea that, if you can't even see your own body, what must that be like if you can take, bright red bathtub paint and you can feel the paint as you wipe it up your arm, but you can also see the motion of your hand and you can see the red of the color, but you can't see your arm, but you can feel it. I think there was something deeply neurologically therapeutic about this experience for my son. And I'm not an art therapist. I don't know anything, but I know it was dual sensory because he could feel the paint as he painted it on his own skin. He could see the motion of his hand and the color as it moved. He could see the color, so these things were really helpful to my son. And I think if my son can teach himself to see with words, if Daniel Kish can teach himself to see with sound, there is so much here as potential therapies and aids for people who have CVI. And I want to be really, really clear. There is so much nonsense about neuroplasticity and CVI. People are repeatedly told that CVI just you grow out of it. It resolves and goes away. Well, brain damage, you don't grow out of brain damage. It
Yeah.
doesn't just go away. Cerebral palsy doesn't just go away. Epilepsy doesn't just go away. These are conditions that stay with you, right? I mean, I'm aware that epilepsy with correct treatment can be helped, right? I'm aware of that. I don't want people coming back going, oh, well, I took medication and blah, blah, blah. Yes, but by itself, it's not going to just go away, right?
Yeah.
So CVI is a permanent condition that you have your whole life, and there is promising practices that can be developed from what we've learned about Sebastian's verbal mediation to process his vision that are not cures for vision. My son's vision wasn't cured because he developed this neuroplastic ability to see with words. He's blind. He's still blind. What having this neuroplastic change in his brain did was it concealed the severity of his blindness. It did not cure it, it hid it from the world.
That is just, his whole story is incredible. You wrote a book, correct?
Oh, yes, I did.
So I'll link that book onto this. So if anybody wants to read it and grab it, it's probably available on Amazon, right?
Yes, it's available on
Okay.
Amazon. It's entitled Eyeless Mind. It's a play on the mind's eye. So, Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen. And I have a lot of links to factual information about CVI for your listeners so they can quickly find reliable, factual, medically and scientifically accurate information about CVI. And so if you have ability to put those in your show notes, I can definitely send those to you as well.
Yeah, for sure. Please. Well, thank you so much for being on here today. It was so educational. Like I said, you just never think of that type of blindness. Like you said, you think of eyes. But I mean, like I said, everything's powered by the brain. So why not? And
Well,
your son is incredible.
thank
You
you.
know, I feel like all the kids and, adults you've described are incredible with the way it just shows how humans can adapt when they have to, right? Like, and
Right.
so much so that you're his mother and you didn't even notice.
Oh,
And
really? Yeah. I mean, Sebastian skipped a grade. He went through the grade promotion process where they evaluate every aspect of your child academically, socially, and physically. And he sailed through the grade promotion process as a third grader without triggering a single red flag. Nobody
dang.
knew. Nobody knew. It's an entirely invisible disability. Just like with my friend's daughter, nobody knew.
Well, thank you so much for all this information.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for being on here.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I am so grateful for this chance to raise awareness. We CVI moms often call CVI the common disability that no one's ever heard of. And it is my job, I feel, to change that. And I really am grateful for you bringing me on your show. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. No, 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 no. This is, like I said, it's so interesting. It's
It's
so
fascinating.
interesting.
The brain is fascinating. So
Yeah.
I just think it's the whole thing is amazing. And these kids just need help. They don't need pity,
Hmm.
they need appropriate help. They need to
Yep.
be recognized as blind or visually impaired and treated as blind and visually impaired people and given the help they need. That's all.
Oh my God. Wasn't that insane? Like, I just am speechless talking about it. It is so cool the way these people adapt to everyday life. She didn't know her son was blind till he was 15. The things he was doing to just live his life daily are incredible. He's a genius. Like, he's literally a genius. He's so smart, and it's just so inspiring. I could imagine for Stephanie, it was probably hard for her finding out at 15, but it's like, how incredible is your baby that they learn to adapt like that? It's just, it was such an informative interview for me. I had never heard of anything like this before, but it makes total sense, right? I hope you liked today's episode. You can follow me at the Mama Jack pretty much everywhere. I'm the Mama Jack on TikTok. I'm the Mama Jack on Instagram. I'm the Mama Jack on Facebook, a group and a person. Please contact me if you have any ideas for new content or if you want to be my new content. And if you have anything to share, please rate and review. That really helps me. Thank you so much for listening today.